Greetings, programs, and welcome back to another episode of the Awesome Friday podcast, the podcast where we discuss two new things every week. My name is Matthew, and I'm your host, and with me, as always, is Simon, my co-host. How are you, Simon?
Hello. I definitely discover things every week because you make me watch stuff that I never would have watched, and I usually enjoy all of it. I enjoy the experience of it, that's for sure. I've definitely watched things. And one of the first things you made me watch that I was not going to watch for ages was Moneyball. I feel like this whole thing started with Moneyball because at that time I knew even less about baseball than I do now. And I'm not really into sport movies anyway. And turns out Moneyball is a fantastic movie. And I never would have watched that. And, you know, we have a list. We have this ongoing thing where Matt has his I Told You So list. And occasionally when I'm bored or I have like those rare fleeting moments where I actually have time to watch something I want to watch, I choose something off the list, I watch it, and then I text him saying, "Why didn't you tell me this is so good?" Usually there's only been one thing, I can't remember what it was now, but one thing on the list that I didn't like, and everything else has been like 10 out of 10. And
what was the one thing? I don't remember what the one thing was either.
And it stood out because usually you're right about everything on the list. And this one thing, it didn't click with me at all. I can't remember what it is now. But I tried watching Master and Commander this week, which I feel like has been the number one in that list for years. Like, how long have I known it? I think it's been there at the top of the list for about a decade. I've never seen Master and Commander, but I've recently watched some boat-related combat movies and really enjoyed them. So I was like, oh, maybe it's time to watch Master and Commander. Turns out it's nowhere to stream. It's absolutely nowhere at all. So I lost my window, but I will watch it.
You could, if you want to talk about Master and Commander, I will buy you Master and Commander. If that's what it takes to get you to watch Master and Commander, I will get it for you.
I've got a really horrible feeling that I'm going to watch Master and Commander and it's going to go straight into my like top 3 all time. Why the hell didn't you watch this like a decade ago kind of movies? I feel like it might be. It seems to be one of these movies that inspires people to great like passion. Even like there's a great video going around of someone celebrating at a sports event, but someone has changed the sporting event to the opening title card of Master and Commander, where it's something like it was the period of war is on the sea, and I'm sure you know the exact quote, but like there's now war is on the ocean, and everyone in the stadium like goes crazy, is like hugging each other, and I feel like people love this movie, and with good reason, I'm sure.
I mean, you know why people love this movie? Yeah. It's because it's a great movie. And the quote is April 1805. Napoleon is master of Europe. Only the British fleet stands before him. Oceans are now battlefields.
Oh my god, it's pretty evocative, isn't it? It's pretty
evocative. And then the next shot is of the HMS Surprise on the ocean and like the text of Captain Aubrey's orders, which I think say something like intercept French privateer, the Acheron, en route to Pacific, intent on carrying the war into those waters. Sink, burn, or take her a prize.
Do you know, there is a lot. I've never really made the equation between Star Trek and naval battles, but there's a lot. It's very similar, isn't it? Like Star Wars battles are not naval battles. Star Wars battles are World War II Spitfire battles. So you have gravity in space, but it's Star Trek battles feel a bit more navally, like properly navally.
I mean, not for nothing, but the best submarine battle movie you'll ever watch is actually The Wrath of Khan. That's literally what it is.
That's a good point, actually.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the best one is probably something like Das Boot, but bear with me here. Like, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is the best submarine battle movie you probably have ever seen.
So I distinctly remember watching Das Boot at exactly the right age because I was really, really young. I was probably about 14, and I watched this incredible movie. If you haven't seen Das Boot, it's about a German U-boat submarine in the Second World War, and it takes a critical hit. And it basically, the middle part of this movie is that it sinks to the bottom of its section of ocean, and people are about to die. And then the whole crew spends about an hour and a half like MacGyvering this submarine into something that can enable them to resurface. And I wrote like this idea, this story of everyone shipping together and fixing the engine so they can live. I stole that wholesale for a book I wrote as well. Mm-hmm. But I remember I watched the end of Das Boot with the great actor Jordan
Jürgen Prochnow.
Right, who was brilliant. And it comes up, and I'm going to spoil the end of this movie, but you get, they survive, they come to the surface, they come to the dock, and then there's a plane attack, and they all die. And they all died just like that. And I remember thinking, what a stupid ending. It was like all that like effort was for nothing. Oh, and suddenly I understood movies. And it was a really important film for me. Great film.
You know, it's been forever since I actually watched that movie. So long that like, it's because there was I think a BBC or it aired on CBC here in Canada, but a BBC miniseries of it recently too. And I was really? Like, I should watch that, and then I just never.
I didn't know that.
Did. Supposed to be pretty good though.
Yes, I will check that out.
But
yeah,
I mean.
So anyway, that's the
the movie that was sort of had that like narrative awakening for me was actually Bridge on the River Kwai. So we're like all that work, and then he blew up. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, movies now more than ever are great. So we that's a decent amount of banter, I think. But like, what? Sorry, go on.
Well, I was thinking about Bridge on the River Kwai, and who would you say, who's the director these days that is making David Lean style like widescreen epic location like personal dramas? Who's
Denis Villeneuve?
Oh, that's a great call. That is a great call.
And like, and I would say that like, you could make an argument that Rian Johnson made one with The Last Jedi. But really, the only person who's making the big sprawling epics, like anything close to like that, and I'm not even just talking about Dune, but also like Arrival and all of that kind of stuff that he's done. Sicario. He's really the only one that's doing Blade Runner 2049, big sprawling epic story. Is as close as I can think.
It's a great call.
Because I think who else would even be in the running for that right now? I can't.
Like Spielberg has had his moments of anything Spielberg shoots is great. So when he shoots big, wide open spaces, they always look the same kind of classic epic feel. But as a whole movie, to have that classic epic, like old-fashioned feel, I think Villeneuve's a good call.
And Spielberg has been, and is the greatest living film director, but lately West Side Story is kind of an exception in his filmography, because the stuff he's been doing lately is stuff like Bridge of Spies and Lincoln and The Post, which are excellent movies and completely underrated, which is a weird thing to say, but I have all these thoughts about these movies. But anyway, they're much smaller, they're much more personally focused. Some of them involve like, global geopolitics or American, the state of American politics, but the stakes within the movie are often quite a little more contained. They're not big sprawling things. Like The Post takes place in like 3 buildings. It's wonderful. And I maintain that if anyone else had directed any of those 3 movies, we would have hailed them as like the next great director of our time.
Yeah.
But Spielberg is the guy who, like, he knocks out a masterpiece every other film, and we're like, it's just Spielberg. Just doing his thing.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Sure. It's absolutely terrible.
So
I don't know any other director who could make me get emotional and tear up just by having one character put a bunch of newspapers on the table, which is exactly what happens at the end of The Post.
I thought you were going to talk about the end of Saving Private Ryan as well, which is a pretty devastating final shot.
Well, Saving Private Ryan though would fit into that more epic style of movie that he
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
used to
totally.
make. That he still could make, but like lately he's been doing these sort of more contained stories.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I'll
anyway,
be very interested to see what shape Indiana Jones 5
5, yeah.
5 is. Like, Mangold's a great director, but he, like, Spielberg, and so much of Indy is Spielberg's eye, and I will be very interested to see how that translates to a different director.
Yeah. Oh well, there's only time will tell.
Yes. So what are we talking about? Let's try. We've
Yeah,
both
okay.
tried to get back on track. What you can tell we haven't talked for a few days, can't you? What are we talking about this week?
So this week we have 2 new things, 1 movie and 1 television show, both of which are now available depending where you live. The first we're going to talk about is a lovely film from A24 and in Canada Elevation Pictures called Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. And I think I'm going to ask you, Simon, to take us through the basics of what is Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. Other
Well,
than, spoiler alert, a wonderful movie.
I've got nothing else to say now. Well, the clues in the title. Marcel is literally a 1-inch tall shell who lives with his grandmother Connie, and he has a pet ball of lint called Alan. And so you can tell from that, like, that whimsical beginning, that the whole movie is this light, full of whimsy kind of approach to the subject, with some things that it wants to teach you feelings, and boy does it teach you feelings. The whole concept of the movie is that there's a dude called Dean who decides to make a really low-key documentary about Marcel, this little shell, and it's beautifully designed. Apparently he's based on a children's book, and I've not heard of it at all, but it's a beautiful curved shell with 1 eyeball and 2 little feet and a
I'm
little
gonna
mouth.
I'm gonna interrupt you there because I think it might actually be the other way around. As I understand it, the original inception of Marcel the Shell was between Jenny Slate and Dean Fleischer-Camp and another person called Elisabeth Holm, and they created a couple of short films and then later made a children's book based on it.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
I believe I might have that backwards, but I believe that's the
Right.
case.
But it's shot. It's all documentary footage of, what, 90% of it, of this guy Dean, just making short, like, daily documentaries of Marcel talking to camera, talking about his life with his grandmother, talking about the rest of his family who tried to hide in a sock drawer, and then through the couple splitting up, they got separated, and it is. It sounds like it shouldn't work, but it works so well, because you've got, it's not animated. You've got the real environments, but Marcel is stop frame animation within those environments, and the way he is animated is so it's so full of character. Like, the whatever the animation studio was that did this really knocked it out of the park, because it looks completely real. There's no forced, like, frame rates like they did in the Lego movie to show it was, pretend it was real things moving. It looks like a real animal. And Dean, the human contingent of this movie, doesn't treat Marcel like he's an alien, just another cute animal. And so it says some things about internet notoriety and what happens when you become viral. But within this story as well, it actually is a story about loss. It's a story about death and how to deal with that. And the way it tells the story is just adorable, absolutely adorable. Um, I've got feelings about appropriacy for certain age ranges, which I'll talk about later. But for the most part, it's done in such. I texted you about this. I'd love to know how they scripted this, because it doesn't sound like a script being read out. It sounds like the actors decided what they wanted their main points of the discussion to be, and they record it, and then they animate over the top of it. And however they did it, it just sounds so natural. they have captured what sounds like completely improvised naturalistic speech and make you believe that it's this animated little snail talking to you, and
And
it's
he's not even a snail. He's literally just a
oh
shell
yeah,
with a
sorry,
single
I meant the
eyeball
shell.
and a pair
Yeah,
of keds.
yeah, and so he becomes internet famous, and through that internet fame, he gets to achieve a very specific dream, and it's interesting that it isn't saccharine. It's not a Disney movie. There are negative sides to the fame. There's moments of great sadness and emotion in the movie. So it is the kind of thing. If you take your kids to this, you should know going in that it's going to bring up some very specific emotions in your kids. But by and large, it is an absolutely lovely film. By the end of the film, and it does end on a positive. By the end of the film, you've got that kind of warm, gooey feeling that you really should have at the end of this kind of thing. It's really lovely. I mean, what did you think of it?
I mean, I loved it. I loved it from beginning to end. Um, I think that you're right on the money when you say that it's not saccharine. It's a very honest portrayal of a number of different emotions, and I think what makes it work. I would say it does it a disservice to say that Dean, the human character, treats Marcel like a pet. I think he treats him like kind of like a more like a child or like a teenager maybe,
Mm,
and that's about where Marcel's at with his like development anyway.
mm-hmm.
Um, and this is a film that will basically teaches you that there's. I mean, it's kind of a spoiler to tell you exactly what it teaches you, but it teaches you how to feel certain things and how to react to certain emotions. And there's one thing that there's a whole sequence where Marcel is living with his Nana Connie, who's the wonderful Isabella Rossellini.
Mm,
She's so good in the
yeah,
voice role. And let me just say too, Jenny Slate as Marcel is amazing. I
yeah,
don't know where her voice comes from. I saw her give an interview where she
no,
talked about how she does Marcel's voice, and she didn't really talk about the inspiration. She just talked about like where in her throat it just comes from.
mm,
Um, but she's so wonderful and heartfelt, and this there's a wonderful sequence in the middle where Nanakani is injured, and he becomes really, really, really overprotective, and it's just like it's exactly the kind of thing that like it's going to bring up some emotions if you take your kids, but you should probably take your kids to this movie. Not your infants, definitely not your infants, but the kids who are just at the point where they're starting to have to grapple
oh,
with like real human emotions in the same way that like Inside Out teaches you that like sadness is key. You know, how to deal with sadness, how to integrate sadness, and how it's not a negative thing to feel sad. This one also teaches you how to grapple with and integrate certain emotions into your life in a really effective and heartfelt way that I don't know if you cried, but I definitely totally didn't cry through the end of this movie. Like not at all. So yeah.
I I agree with you up to a point. I have an 8-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son, and I think the interesting thing about this movie is that it doesn't quite deal with grief like Inside Out does, which Inside Out does big all of his emotions are big and are color coded, and the emotion in Marcel, like it's hard to talk about this without spoiling anything. It's a lot
It's a little
slower,
more it's a little
and
more
it
adult. Or
it's
it's
a
a little
little
more
more
young
adult.
adult.
I think it would be appropriate for my 11-year-old son. I think if my 8-year-old daughter had watched this, I don't think she would have ever stopped crying, because there is a
Well,
moment hang on. There's a moment when you realize what's going on, and it's devastating. And I don't think it helps as well. I'm perhaps swayed that we have her relevant relatives staying with us at the moment as well, and I think so. She's very much thinking about that. She's also very sensitive in that she picks up on emotions very strongly. So, what were you going to say?
I agree with you regarding the age thing. I wasn't
Yeah.
trying to say like you shouldn't take. I should rephrase. I don't think you should take your children to it necessarily. I mean, your whatever parents are listening, like you can judge your kids' own emotional development
Mm.
however you want. But I would say that like this is a film for kids who are actually around the age that the girl, the main character Riley in Inside Out was. So like 11,
Mm.
12, like 10, 11,
Yeah,
12, like not quite
yeah,
teenager, but no longer a child. Tween
no,
or whatever they're called,
yeah, totally.
Kids who are
That's
learning
exactly the range.
learning to deal with these more adult emotions, basically.
Hmm.
And I know that we're sort of talking around it. You could probably get an idea of what emotions we're talking about, but it is a wonderful film, and you should totally see it. Um, I think it might be one of the best things I've seen this year. I don't know.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
is that hyperbole? I don't probably, but
I what I've just I mentioned this at the top as well. What really struck me is that it shouldn't work as well as it does. I mean, it's 100% on Rotten Tomatoes at the moment, which I know aggregate sites are not perfect indications of anything, but it's one of those movies that is so well done and so well done for a number of different ages and a number of different reasons, and it's so charming. Even though, if you look at the poster, you would think it's a childish kid movie, but it's
when
really not. It's
the trailer hypes up how um, cute it is as well, which I don't think is
yeah,
I think is actually kind of a good thing, kind of purposefully good thing in that I think it's really smart to sneak in the emotional stuff in a film like this.
mm,
Because it does sort of start really positive and end really positive, and then there's some real like
yeah.
emotional depth in the middle, right? Um,
I just feel
so I
sorry. I feel sorry for the mum who is at the cinema. I was like, oh, has got a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they're like, oh, look, we'll go and see this cute snail movie. I it, like those ages are too young for the way grief is dealt with in this film, and there are. It's really good to learn about loss and grief, but different ages learn about it in different ways, and you got to be really careful about that. And you're totally right about the 11, 12 year old. This is exactly what someone my son's age should watch. But I
yeah, I
think
mean,
as you
I
get
think
younger, it's a different ballgame.
yeah, I would argue that I think it's totally up to every parent to judge their kid's emotional maturity as well.
Hmm.
Like, I definitely think
Hmm.
your son is definitely old enough to see this now, but I think, and this is to be fair, this is just my impression of your kids, but I think your daughter will probably be ready to see it earlier than he would have been, if that makes sense. In the same way that like my sister has two kids, and one of them is going to be ready for this before the other for sure. Like,
Hmm.
and it's just a matter of where they're at with their own, because every kid is unique, just like
Hmm.
every person is unique, right? So,
Hmm.
but it doesn't matter because I'm a 41-year-old man, and it made me cry. So it's a wonderful artistic film, and it's so full of just it's so guileless and innocent and wonderful in the way it deals with everything.
And
And on
it's
the one
really
hand,
clever. It's really
yeah,
clever
it's
because
super clever.
on the one hand, what? Sorry.
I was going to say, on the one hand, it has this, really sort of deep emotional section through the middle, but on the other hand, it has Marcel recurringly ask people like, "Have you ever eaten a raspberry? And what's that like for you?" Like,
And the guy just hangs up on him.
yeah, it's pretty great. But he
I
asked
did
it like,
enjoy it. Like, sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
it's just that he asked that question a number of times. Like, he is a kid, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and the way he states things is so matter of fact and guileless is the word I like. The
Mm,
same way that kids
mm,
can, right? Like, there's a
mm.
great moment toward the beginning where he's like, "Well, everyone knows that it takes about 20 shells to make a community," and then like 5 seconds later, he's like, "And it's just the two of us now." It's like
Oh,
it's
don't.
so like wonderfully
Yeah.
like it's not manipulative or anything. It's just
No.
a small person stating a fact in a way that's sort of utterly devastating. you know?
It is. It is because it's a child dealing with separation and then with grief. And it's very hard to watch a child deal with those kind of things. It's not it's not pleasant. And I think that a lot of the emotional core of this is not just how he deals with it when he's faced with it, which I thought was very real, but also how he moves on from it in a way that adults don't. Like, it was very cleverly written, and honestly, the resolution of this film, where he finds light in the darkness, if you will, that's the moment that put a little thing in my throat. It wasn't so much that terrible, 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 awful moment about 10 minutes earlier after the interview on TV, which you know what I'm talking about, which was
Mm-hmm.
just gut wrenchingly awful because you know as an audience what is happening. It wasn't so much that point that got me. It was just the as a child figuring out what it means and going forward with a positive sense of it, which is such an important lesson, isn't it? But it's just a really beautiful ending, and I really like how they found a positive way to end this very difficult movie to watch. It's weird saying Marcel's a difficult movie to watch because it is so well done and it's so light and funny and clever and frequently hilarious. Like, one of his modes of transport is to get inside a tennis ball and just launch him around and bumping into things, and just little things like at one point the dog tries to chase him and he has to get out of the way. And it's just lovely. It's just lovely, but there are some parts of this movie are difficult to watch,
Yeah.
like
I also,
intentionally.
yeah. And the way that Marcel just, I think I'm just retreading stuff, but like the way he speaks is so wonderful as well. Like when he's run away from the dog and the dog is like, there's one moment where he's like on a shelf and the dog is around the corner and like panting, and Marcel's like, oh, his face smells so bad. Just, yeah. Or there's a moment, I think it's in the trailer, where Leslie Stahl, who they're huge fans of for some, because it's hilarious, asks Marcel like how long he's been separated from his family, and he's like, "Well, I don't know how long it's been exactly, but I know there's a big black space in my heart that grows wider and longer with every day." And then Leslie Stahl's like, "Dean, do you know?" He's like, 2 years. And then he's like, "Oh, 2 years. That's great to know."
Yeah, I
Just,
love that.
yeah,
That's
it's just
a great example of the whole script being that mix of Marcel seeing the world and Dean seeing the facts, and
yeah,
how neither negates the other. Like, Marcel doesn't feel upset that he knows it's like everything is extra good information for him, and
yeah,
it's a really kind of it's a lesson in optimism, isn't it? His whole approach without it being naive. It's really nice. It's a really
yeah,
lovely film. Yeah.
yeah. So this Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is the latest release from A24 Pictures and Elevation Pictures here in Canada. It's currently playing in limited release in both Vancouver and Toronto. So if you live in one of those two cities, please go see it. It expands to the rest of the country, I believe, on July the 15th. What are you going to give this 1 out of 5, Simon?
It's a 4 for me.
A 4? Like a high 4?
Yeah.
Like a low 4? Like a
Come on, we don't do variants of 4. We have numerical simplicity in this house. I mean,
that is true.
it's a like I think I'm a slightly harsher. Like, a 5 for me has to be mind blowing and completely different and changes my entire attitude towards film as a medium. So a four is pretty great.
I mean, as long as there's no pressure there. Like,
Like,
damn.
if I genuinely loved a movie from beginning to end and thought it was lovely, like I did, it's a 4. Like,
Hmm.
there has to be, for me, a 5 is honestly, it's a little deviation, but I can't believe that I watched The French Dispatch, and that is the easiest 5 like ever for me. But we'll talk
Hmm.
about that another time. That movie, I don't even like Wes Anderson as a director, and that movie just blew me away. So it blew me away, so it's a 5. I really loved it, so it's a 4. So this is a 4 movie.
Interesting. Interesting.
I take it you're a
Uh,
5.
it's 5 out of 5. For me, it's a little different. I need something to make me feel the feelings and feel them strongly, and this does that for
Yeah,
sure. Um,
awesome.
it's also interesting that what am I going to say? So A24 is a studio that's mostly known for I mean, they're known for a lot of things, but a lot of
Yeah,
people, when
they're
you
great.
say A24, you end up thinking about horror movies, but
Mm-hmm.
this is lately a lot of their films have been very focused on family, which I find,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah, they're really
yeah,
great. 84 are really, really great at producing good movies.
yeah, and they seem to know the ones that they purchase rather than produce. They seem to have a very discerning eye for
Mm-hmm.
making sure everything fits with the tone that they're going for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Marcel the
Yes.
Shell with Shoes On. That's a solid recommendation. Everybody go and see it wherever
Yeah.
you can see it.
Great
So
voice cast
let's.
too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, everyone in it is great. Um, so let's move on. I guess
So
it's
yeah.
very much like the next thing we're going to talk about, except for that it's not. Um, the fourth season of Stranger Things, colloquially known as Stranger Things 4, today is Sunday, so it was released 2 days ago when you're listening to this, and I have watched all of it, and Simon has watched none of it, so he is going to ask
No.
me.
So some context for this, because we talked about if we were going to do this. I haven't just watched none of season 4. Out of the entirety of Stranger Things as a thing, I have watched half of the first episode of season 1. That is the beginning and the end of my knowledge of Stranger Things. And so I'm actually going to talk to you about it because I'm fascinated by the thing that I know nothing about in a way that I wasn't interested about Game of Thrones or any of the multitude of other things that I have not caught up on. I
Mm-hmm.
find Stranger Things as this cultural thing. And it's really interesting watching, like, going through TikTok when you don't know what the references are. And as soon as the Stranger Things episode comes out, it's like, oh no, Dan did this one thing. That means he played this one bar on the guitar. That means he did this 4 seasons ago. It's really interesting to not be the Star Wars geek
Mm-hmm.
for this one. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So tell me, just on a general level, generally, now you've seen the end of season 4 and all of its movie length episodes. What is it about? Like, give me the pitch for Stranger Things. What's the pitch line for the entirety of the first 4 seasons of Stranger Things?
The pitch line for the entirety of Stranger Things is that the creators of the show, who are known as the Duffer Brothers, because they are brothers whose last name is Duffer. Shocking.
Wow.
Um,
Fascinating.
basically, they gave an interview at one point where they talked about the two Steves who raised them, and what that is in reference to is that they grew up huge fans of Steven Spielberg and Stephen King. And if you watch Stranger Things, you know that it is basically a mashup of the sensibilities of Steven Spielberg and Stephen King. It's a horror movie starring a bunch. It's a horror show. It stars a bunch of plucky kids in the '80s who are going on adventures and fighting monsters. And um, yeah, that's the pitch. It's a Stephen King, Steven Spielberg inspired '80s set horror monster show.
Okay, and so before we get to talking about the 4th season in detail, do you feel like uh, does it feel as you've gone through the first 4 seasons that this was a show with a plan and still has a plan, or are we in a lost situation where they're just making it up as they go along? Like, what's the feeling with this show? Do you feel like they have an end game that they have always been going towards?
So I don't know the actual answer to this question, but season one ended with a bit of a cliffhanger, as I recall, but it felt effectively complete. Um, but with the caveat that like there's a major character that has a thing happening that only you know, right? Like there's a cliffhanger,
Mm.
and season two deals with that character and everything that happened that without spoiling it for you who hasn't seen it, season two again feels like a continuation of season one, but complete, right? Um, season three is a little different than the first two. It has a much smaller focus. There's also fewer episodes, um, and it's set like months and months later. Um, and it's much more of a straightforward like monster horror show.
Mm-hmm.
And it also ends in a way that feels complete, except for that there's a teaser for the fourth season that's in the form of a post credits, which I'll come back to because I have lots of thoughts about it.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth season, because we know they have a fourth, and I think they pretty much knew they must have just known they were getting a fifth. The fourth season ends in such a way that it is definitely an end of a chapter, but there's a shit ton of stuff to resolve.
Oh,
So,
okay.
like, it basically needs a fifth season at this point. Like, it doesn't, to call it a cliffhanger would be, I guess it's accurate. I don't know. Basically, what happens at the end of the fourth season, without getting into too much spoilers, there's a major thing that happens that they can't not deal with, so they need another season, and it feels like they planned for that. So have they had a plan since day one? I don't. Doesn't necessarily feel that way, but does it feel like they've ever not had a plan once the season starts? No, not at all. It feels like and season 3, I think, is the best example of that. I think they knew that, like, we could tell the story in fewer episodes in a much more straightforward way. I'm just sort of rambling at this point. It generally feels like they have a plan. Yes.
Well, that's good. That's good because I know you've just rewatched all of Game of Thrones as well, and you've told me the last seasons were kind of freewheeling towards nothing, and so it's good if you're so invested in a show. It's good that it actually feels like it's been designed and intended to go a certain way, to have a certain tone, and to tell a certain story.
Yeah, and it's tough though. Like, there's lots to do with every season that I think is not great. I think very generally it's a very good show. I think a lot of people pour a lot of love into it. I think that it is, from a production value standpoint, it is impeccable. From a production design standpoint, it's impeccable. I think all of the actors they get are amazing in their parts. I also think that I don't want to say they've hit like a creative wall, but I think they've also maybe been trapped by their own success just a little bit. In that there's a character in season 4 who's introduced in the first episode and dies in the last episode. And that's kind of a spoiler. If you watch the show, you'll be able to figure out who I'm talking about. But the point I'm trying to make is that, like, they did that last year too, and the year before.
Oh, really?
Like,
Introduced in the first episode and dies in the last?
yeah. So it feels like the show is kind of afraid to take any kind of, like, big swing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't ever feel, and, like, even in season 3. So this is a spoiler for you, but no one else, because everybody else has watched it. But at the end of season 3, one of the main characters, he's the sheriff of the town, the small American town they live in. He's also the adopted father of one of the main kid characters. He sacrifices himself to save the day, and at the end of the episode, as we understand it, he's dead. And then there's a post-credit scene that heavily implies that he's not. And I just feel like that's, like, I think that this season 4, and I know people are going to get upset with this when I say this, but I think season 4 might have been better if he had stayed dead. Because they bring him back in season 4, and his storyline lasts the entire season, and it could have been one episode, maybe 2.
Mm.
And they just didn't have the, for lack of a better way to say it, they just didn't have the guts to leave him dead. And it feels like that. Like, there's another character, a main character, who at the end of season 4 is in a coma, and I feel like the bolder direction would have been, and to be fair, they're never going to kill off a child. I don't think, not a main child. I mean, I say that, but lots of kids have died on this show. I just don't think they're going to kill off a main character at this point, and I feel like it would have been more interesting if they had.
Do you feel like the ratio of filler to killer is getting a bit more skewed towards the former as the seasons roll on?
That's a tough call. Season 2 felt like a lot of filler, as I recall. Season 3, being shorter and more to the point, has almost no filler, really, and introduces one of the best characters in the whole show. Season 4 is, I think, a little bit overlong, but it's hard to call it filler. I would say that the problem with season 4 is more that they made 9 episodes, which range anywhere from an hour to 2.5 hours in length. And I feel like if they'd stuck to a more consistent format, it might have allowed them to cut things down a little bit, or at least to tell the story in a slightly, like, I don't think the last 2 episodes of season 4, which are what just came out, are 4 hours long, 90 minutes and 2.5 hours, and they just didn't need to be.
That's just
Right?
ridiculous. Like, do they earn that time? I know you've mentioned they should have been cut down, but like, is it?
So
Are
again,
there
I don't.
story elements that need that extended, like the breadth to tell that story more? Or like, what could they have cut out here?
So again, I don't think they needed to cut anything out. I think they needed to pick a structure and stick to it. Right? Like, I think it should have been 4 1 hour episodes, or 3 slightly overlong episodes, maybe. But it didn't need to be. The last episode did not need to be 2.5 hours long. There's definitely spots to cut into it. And it sounds like I'm trying to like complain about the show, but I'm not. I really enjoy it. I think it's a solid, 3 out of 5, very generally speaking. I think season 3 is the strongest season, personally. But I think they're at a point where all of their characters are so beloved. You're the English teacher. Which of those is right?
You can have either of those. If
Okay.
We tend to use beloved for like someone you're romantically involved
Right.
with. You can say beloved. Whatever you want. It's English. Just make it up. Everyone else
Yeah,
does.
that's fair. Well, in that case, all the main characters are so beloved-thunked that that I just feel like they're unwilling to take any major risks with any of the main characters. And in a show that everyone is meant to be in peril, ostensibly all of the time, it makes it feel a little bit toothless. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, when the characters do have a high beloved office, then that's important.
Yeah.
What's the is the all 4 seasons, are they so far, is it about roughly the same thing, or is it a bit of a Doctor Who situation where there's
Oh, no. It's all
each
this. It's all
season
the same
brings in
thing.
a new big bad and a new level of hell, and new, like, what is the thing that they're fighting? What is the stranger thing? And what is the strange thing that so you can have a stranger thing, you need a strange thing to begin with. So what are those two things?
So it's kind of tough to explain in a soundbite, but effectively in the first season we learn there's one of the kid characters whose name is 11. Um, she is she's a superhero basically. She can read minds. She's telekinetic, and more critically, at some point she's the subject of these government experiments, and at some point they have managed to breach the walls between our dimension and this sort of hellish alternate dimension called the Upside Down, that they refer to as the Upside Down. And the reason they call it that is that it is literally upside down from the real world. Like, if your house is standing wherever your house is standing, then in the Upside Down, it's there too, just down is up and up is down. Right? Like, imagine it extrudes out from the bottom of your house, this upside down house.
I've seen the Lego set, so I can picture that.
Yeah. And there's an evil entity that lives in the Upside Down that seems to control the entire place, called the Mind Flayer, which is introduced in season. It's introduced earlier, but like it's really explored more in seasons 2 and 3, and it has several minion type monsters. And they're all referred to by Dungeons and Dragons names. So there's the Demogorgon, is the main sort of flower faced one in the first season, and then there's smaller versions of that, and then in this 4th season they introduce a new sort of villain who's kind of like a general from the Upside Down. Like, not, we don't understand him to be like the Mind Flayer, but he's like a top tier bad guy from the Upside Down. He's called, and they refer to him as Vecna, who's a very famous like Dungeons and Dragons evil bad guy. But it's all from the Upside Down is the main thing. And there's varying government responses to it. There's a whole like the Russians are trying to get there too element to it. It's all, I mean, on paper, it's all very silly. But like, it's the monsters are scary. The monsters are pretty scary, and the Upside Down is really well conceived. And yeah, every time they open a gate, it's bad news.
So is this one of the shows where each season they're like, oh, we've just learned something new about the Upside Down. Like, we've got this extra thing to go do. We thought we
Kind of.
solved it last season, and now we've got this whole new thing to do.
It's, yeah, basically. Like every season, a door is open to the Upside Down, and every season that door is closed, and it's opened for different reasons, and we learn something more as to why, and then it gets closed.
So what's the element for you that brings you back to that makes you stick with what how many hours, how many episodes, how many hours have you watched in the last week of this? Like it's
Well, bear in
over.
mind that season 4 was split into 2 parts. So the first 7 episodes
Okay,
were over a month ago, and they were all an hour. I think the longest one is like an hour and 20. It's only these last two that were like
right,
egregiously
okay.
long that came out this past Friday.
But
Um,
what does what
but
what
like
what
at
does
this point,
Stranger Things?
like
Sorry.
what does it do for me? I mean, it's a big
Yeah,
nostalgia
why?
trip, right? Like
What,
we must be in that point of history where these shows are set in the 80s, which is when you and I were kids, right?
mm-hmm, yeah.
And it's a bit wishful thinking. Like these kids are huge nerds and they're making references that like you just know in real life they wouldn't be able to make. Like a great example of this is that in the first season, one of the main kids has a poster of John Carpenter's The Thing on his wall, and The Thing was not a successful movie in the 80s. Like it didn't become
Mm-hmm,
successful until home video was really like a big thing.
mm-hmm.
And so it's just one of those things where like it's very much the Duffer Brothers ideal 80s, but there's monsters there. It's,
I generally find that kind of 80s like uh, rose tinted nostalgia with lots of references that really turns me off generally. Like, do they find the balance? Are
oh,
there
it
too
finds a
many
balance
80s
right away.
references? Right.
It's not even
There's not.
there's not too many 80s references. No, I mean except in as much as that like they are in the 80s. But
Right.
it's not like they're saying where's the beef every 5 minutes. That they're it just set in the 80s, and it finds a really
right.
nice balance. Again, the production design in particular is exquisite, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of that is how the 80s looks and how everyone dresses, and how they speak. But ultimately, it's a show about these kids who are best friends. It's about you know found family in friendship. Um,
Right.
and in the same way that like I guess the closest example, even though it's not a movie that I totally like, would be like the kids are very much like the Goonies or like the Losers Club from
Right.
It,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, they are best friends. They hang out together. Their parents never know where they are. And instead of being like just like hiding in a tree fort, they're fighting huge monsters. It's and one of them happens to be telekinetic.
Why is she
So,
telekinetic? Like, is that the
uh,
reason for that? Is that a thing, or
so
is it?
in the first season, there's a government lab in Hawkins, and
Mm-hmm.
she's like the main subject. But through the course of the series, we find out that there are several children with these special powers who have been at that lab over time.
Mm-hmm.
She's just the main one that we know. And the reason she's called 11 is that she was never named. She
Mm-hmm.
just has a tattoo of the number 11 on her wrist
Right. Right.
because she was the 11th child.
Let's talk about season 4 then. Like, what's the kind of bottle concept of season 4? Like, what differentiates it from the other 3 seasons? What does it add?
I mean, that's the main thing. It adds a more relatable villain in Vecna.
Mm-hmm.
So the season 4 takes place 8 months, I believe it is, after season 3. The main plot with the kids who are still in Hawkins is that there's this new thing happening, and they figure out pretty quickly that there's like a new villain they haven't faced before from the Upside Down. Several of the kids have moved to a different state, and so there's a long running story with them. And then this one character, who, again, Hopper was, died, air quotes, at the end of season 3, and he's
Mm-hmm.
revealed to be alive in a Russian prison in
Mm-hmm.
season 4, and he's gotten there because at the end of season 3 he dies to allow a gate to the Upside Down to be closed, and a machine explodes, and it looks like he's caught in the explosion, but actually he managed to get through the gate, and then the Russians find him and they put him anyway.
Hmm.
The
So,
it's and it's a good show. Like it's a fun show. It's a very well realized show. I definitely think I can't help but think about it in a more, I don't want to say negative way, but like, since we only watched it yesterday, I'm definitely having a hard time not thinking about my perceived sort of flaws, like characters who should have died or should have stayed dead or maybe shouldn't have died, and just the structure of the show. And it's not, it's not totally fair to say they're not taking a big swing because it ends on such a big cliffhanger, like on such a big thing happening. But like that was the kind of thing that would happen if this was a film series. This is also what would happen at the end of the second to last one. You know,
Yeah.
it's nothing I. It's a really good version of this kind of story, but it's also nothing I haven't seen before. If that makes sense.
Do you do you think the as it becomes more popular and you get more seasons, is it getting safer in the way it tells the story? Like, did it take more risks at the beginning when it was just a brand new show and there was no expectation for any of the characters to live?
Uh,
Do you get the sense it's getting safer as it goes on?
I don't know I don't know if that's the right way to put it exactly. For me, it's more that like the characters are in no less danger now. Like from a, what am I trying to say? Ostensibly, the entire world is in more peril in season 4 than it was in seasons 1, 2, or 3. But it
Mm-hmm.
never really feels like any of the characters are in real danger of dying.
Mm-hmm.
And the one character that does end up feeling like they're in real danger of dying, spoiler alert, doesn't. And so I'm sorry if you're listening to this and you haven't watched it yet. Like it's not huge spoilers, and I don't think any of what I'm saying would be a total surprise. I think people would probably be pretty outraged if the character I'm talking about did die. They are, to be clear, my favorite character in the show, but
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have been more resonant if they had. You know, I think I think that,
Is
and
it?
the character, and there's a character they introduced this year who ends up dying, who I feel like would have been way more interesting if those spots had been reversed and the team had to, the Scooby Gang had to deal with this
Yeah.
new dynamic. I just
Do,
don't,
do they?
I just don't think they have the guts to do that. You know?
There's just too much plot armor for the main like gang now. I guess that they have become the face of this show. They can't. If they kill off one of this core group, they're going to alienate a massive section of their fan base.
Yeah, and that totally sucks, right?
Yeah.
Like it totally sucks. And not to say like I don't. That's not to say I want a character to die. It's just that I feel like if they're going to put
No.
characters in peril, those characters should actually be in peril.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this was the problem in Kenobi as well, where you know that Kenobi, Darth Vader, Leia, you know that they have to survive. There's no real peril, no matter what happens to them. Like in the final fight, I'm not going to talk long about Kenobi, but in the final fight, which is meant to be this like fight for the ages, and they both arrive on Night Planet 32. Like, you know that they're both going to be fine after this. There's no actual stakes. So
Mm-hmm.
that sounds a bit like what you're talking about with the main group here. There's no stakes. It doesn't feel like anyone's in any actual danger.
Yeah, it's tough to make that call 100% when I know there's one more season coming and there's lots of choices they could make. I just
Mm-hmm.
fear they're not going to make them. They're not going to make the harder
Mm-hmm.
choices. And the season does do a thing. Again, otherwise it's very effectively written. Like the season does end on a moment of like, "Yay, we won." And then, "Oh, no, wait, maybe we didn't." um
Ah,
and it's effective with characters looking off into the distance at the new thing they're going to have to deal with, but
mm-hmm.
it's tough, and it's tough to talk about
Mm-hmm.
it like this too, because just to be clear again, I like the show.
Mm-hmm.
I like the characters, I like the concept, I like the setting. I think that as much as I think Hopper maybe should have stayed dead, I think that James Harbour is fantastic in the show. I think Winona Ryder is fantastic in the show.
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, it's so, I just want it to take more chances.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think in the kids are all like uniformly great as well. Like
Mm-hmm.
Millie Bobby Brown deserves every moment of superstardom that she is gaining from this
Oh,
show.
really? Oh, good.
Um, and I'm not as a huge fan of Finn Wolfhard, but there's no denying that like he's a good actor and he's playing his part well. And same with
Mm-hmm.
what's his name, Gaten
Mm-hmm.
Matarazzo, I think, who plays Dustin, is sort of this like the nerdy one, and then there's Caleb McLaughlin. Like they both do really well playing the versions of the '80s characters in a show about '80s kids. You know what I'm trying to say? Like they fit pretty specific
Mm-hmm.
roles in that sort of Goonies template, and
Mm-hmm.
I think they work. I think they do really well. I guess I just want them to take more risks. It's what it comes down to.
What would be your do you think season 5 actually will be the last season? Do you think it's the have they said it will be the last season? Or do you
That
suspect
is
that it will be?
that is the word that season 5 will be the final season.
So what would you like to see happen in season 5?
Well, I want to see them win, but I would like there to be some more lasting consequence to their winning, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I just don't feel like they're gonna get that. They haven't gotten that so far, not in a meaningful way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like I say, there's no one from like the core group who I feels like they're in any real danger,
Right.
and
Yeah,
I would
that's
like
a
that to
problem.
change.
Yeah.
And like it's a problem. Like I guess you can raise the stakes by having people get hurt, but they do that, but
Mm-hmm.
again, not in any real scary way, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
say, and the one time they do, it felt like they were going to take a risk. They backtracked it almost immediately. So it's. I mean, again, it's tough. I just want to be clear. I like this show.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm just having a hard time not feeling about these few things, thinking
yeah.
about these few things that I feel might make it a more effective show.
But you weren't frustrated watching it. This is all like in hindsight, right?
Oh, for sure.
Is that
Like
fair? Right.
I do think this whole like Russia digression was just a digression. I think that could have been resolved. Like make it one episode and have it be done. Don't like
Mm-hmm.
stretch it out through the whole season.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that was really my only real point of frustration with the show while I was watching it. And it's not a bad story. It just didn't need to be a season long arc. You know.
Is it the kind of show that you recommend to others, like people like me? Would you recommend it purely based on the number of hours you'd have to trawl through now, like 4 seasons? Is it something that you recommend to other people?
Honestly, it's a popular enough show that I don't really have to. People are either going to watch it or they're not going to watch it. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's good. I think you should totally check it out. I think you, who has a bit of a hard time with horror stuff, might bounce off
Very
parts of it
specific. Yeah.
because there are moments throughout the show where like the monsters are legitimately scary or gross and scary.
Yeah, no,
Um,
monsters are fine. I have no problem with monsters.
like I think the monster in season 3 is one of my favorite TV show monsters, maybe of all time.
What's the
Uh,
name of that monster?
so it's a bit tough to explain, but in season 3, so at the end of season 2, there's a gate open to the Upside Down, and the Mind Flayer is like sending minions in or whatever. And at the end of the season, 11 closes the gate, but a piece of the Mind Flayer is left behind. In season 3, that piece of the Mind Flayer starts assembling basically a kaiju body so that it can come and kill 11. But the way it does that is it starts with rats and eventually moves on to humans. It sort of like possesses the rats and then brings them all to a central location and then basically implodes them and then uses the like guts and viscera to make a new body.
My God,
It's gross and amazing.
that sounds incredible.
It is. And by the time they have their big final fight, it's made up of like dozens of people and lots of other things. It's totally gross. It's actually kind of like John Carpenter's. It's very influenced by
Yeah,
John
yeah,
Carpenter's The Thing.
yeah,
But it's I mean, yeah, it's a good show. I think you should probably watch it.
yeah.
It's I don't know that what I know of your viewing habits. I don't know that you would like it, but I think most people do. I think it hits the right buttons, the nostalgia buttons, in the right order. That it's generally speaking, again, it's a good show. It's a very solid show. Season 4 for me is a pretty solid 3 out of 5, and generally speaking, I think that's pretty representative of the show. I think first season is a 4, and the second season is a 3, and the third season's a 4, and the fourth season's a 3.
That's fair enough. And who's your standout single member of the cast? I know you mentioned your favorite character, but who's the actor that's really like surprised you in this whole thing that you think is the best? Is it Millie Bobby Brown?
No, it's hard to pick one. But for me, it would either be in this season. I think that Sadie Sink is probably the standout in terms of acting among the kids. Sadie Sink, you'll remember, she was in the second of the Fear Street movies last year. She's probably the standout. She's also Max Mayfield is probably my favorite character in the show. I mean, David Harbour is going to be the standout all the time. He was already great, but he's the standout from the show. If you're not talking about Millie Bobby Brown, he's like the main breakout guy, right?
Hey, did you ever watch his Hellboy?
Yes, I did.
That's another discussion, I'm sure.
Nah, we don't need to talk about it.
No, I don't hear good things. Yeah, he is a great actor, David Harbour. He is good. I mean, the cast is the reputation of the cast in this is just phenomenal. Like it
and the show is made, and you can tell from every frame of watching it, the show is made with a high degree of love and care. Like it is well worth watching, and you totally should. Will you specifically like it, Simon? I have no idea, but I think generally people should definitely give it a try.
Right, but who knows if I'd like it? No, that's a good point. Well, maybe I will.
It has just enough of the kind of nostalgia that you bounce off, and just enough of the kind of horror that you bounce off of, that I worry about you specifically.
Honestly,
but I think everyone should try it.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, perfect. What have we got coming up in the next week?
Well, we are 2 weeks away from our 1-year anniversary since relaunching this podcast. So in celebration, I think we're taking next week off, for reasons. And then we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with, hopefully, if all goes to plan, we'll be talking about Ms. Marvel, we'll be talking about Thor: Love and Thunder, and we'll be talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole. That's right, we're going to do a Marvel extravaganza for our 1-year anniversary. So look forward to that in 2 weeks' time. And next week we're going to take, we're mostly taking a rest because we want to, not because we need to, but we are taking a rest.
We may need to. It's to gather ourselves for the Marvel extravaganza the week after.
Indeed. Good. Well, with that, I think we're going to sign off. We're just over an hour, so I'm going to sign us off. Simon, do you have anything else you want to say to the people?
No, thank you for listening. I'm getting some gaming thoughts together, so check the site for a new gaming podcast. Hopefully soon. I've started playing a few bits and bobs, and there's one particular Switch game which is I can't actually decide if it's even a game. So you can be sure I'll have something to say about that. That might be coming out. But thank you for listening.
Yeah, well, good. Well, again, I couldn't say it better myself. Thank you so much for listening. If you have liked what you have heard, please consider giving us a 5-star review, a like, or a subscription on your podcasting platform of choice. We are available on all of them, pretty much, whether you're listening to Apple, Spotify, Podbean, Google, Amazon. We're on all the ones. Check the website for a listing. If you'd like to support us in a little more direct way, we do have a Patreon. You can find that linked in the show notes, but it is patreon.com/MCSimpson. That's McSimpson. Yes, I know. That's just my initials. And please do that. We would greatly appreciate you. But we do appreciate each and every one of you who do take the time to listen. Thank you so much. We will see you in 2 weeks. And I forgot to say that we, of course, record this on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. So, we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for listening and joining us on this awesome Friday.